Here's some bad advice on how to defend Christianity.
Always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect.
You're not going to get clicks on YouTube that way. If you want to make it big as a Christian influencer, you have to do it with smarminess and condescension.
Every Christian is called to be prepared to make a defense for what we believe.
Given how often I rebut the same arguments over and over again, that preparation seems to consist mostly of memorizing a script.
And the word that's used here, translated into English as defense, is the Greek word apologia. And this is where we get our English word apologetics. Apologetics just means giving a reason for what you believe. And when it comes to the realm of Christian apologetics, this can span a lot of different disciplines like science, logic, philosophy, and history. Christian apologetics basically has two goals. Number one, to provide reasons why Christianity is true, and number two, to communicate those reasons to the world. Now, this can seem overwhelming if you've never studied apologetics before.
And embarrassing if you have studied apologetics before.
There can be all kinds of different questions people have, skeptical claims brought against Christianity. Today, we're going to talk through 5 basic apologetics questions that I think every Christian should be prepared to answer. Now, this can seem overwhelming when we see the broad spectrum of skeptical claims that's brought against Christianity or the many questions brought about by honest seekers. So my goal today is certainly not to give an extensive answer to each one of these questions, but maybe to give the start of an answer, maybe show you a couple of ways to think about each of these questions, and then I'm going to give you resources at the end of each question so that you can learn more if it's a question that interests you. So number 1. Have the New Testament documents been corrupted?
Yes, but to be fair, there are editions of the Bible that have footnotes pointing out passages that look the most like contrived editions.
Well, obviously, when the New Testament was being written, we didn't have a printing press, so each manuscript had to be copied by hand. And when the original documents no longer exist, scholars use a science called textual criticism to reconstruct the wording of ancient texts. When they have a lot of manuscripts and early manuscripts, they can do this with a great deal of accuracy. The New Testament documents have more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts to support their accuracy than any work of ancient classical literature.
This makes it sound like there are no classical documents that were penned by their original authors. There are plenty of surviving correspondence letters written by their original authors. The earliest surviving copies of Paul's letters were created roughly 100 years after Paul died.
In fact, most scholars agree that the New Testament has been copied with an unprecedented high level of accuracy. There's really just a very small percentage of variations between the manuscripts that affect the meaning of the text. And among those, there isn't one that calls into question any cardinal Christian doctrine.
A famous example of a likely forgery is the passage in the Gospel of John in which Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." This passage is absent from the earliest copies of the Gospel. I don't know where exactly you draw the line between a cardinal doctrine and a non-cardinal one, but it seems like it's a pretty influential passage even if it's not a cardinal doctrine.
Question number 2. Is there any evidence that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened?
There's hearsay evidence, if you count that. It's the weakest kind of evidence, and as such, it's pretty far from the kind of evidence I would need to see to be convinced that somebody actually rose from the dead.
So, esteemed historian and New Testament scholar Gary Habermas collected over 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works written between 1975 and 2003 about the resurrection of Jesus. These works ranged from the ultra-liberal to the far-right conservative, and he discovered that virtually every scholar agreed on several points surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. Here are 4 of them. Number 1, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Number 2, that Jesus' disciples believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them and were willing to suffer and die for these beliefs.
I don't know where Christians get the idea that the disciples were willing to suffer and die specifically for the belief in the resurrection. I've yet to see any document that claims that the disciples who were martyred specifically for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Given that they were followers of a guy who rebelled against the Roman occupation of Judea, that would give the Roman authorities enough of a reason to execute them even if they didn't believe that the resurrection happened.
Number 3, that the church persecutor Paul suddenly became a Christian after having an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus.
But it's not clear that he believed that Jesus underwent a bodily resurrection. The encounter is described in Acts as Paul hearing a voice that claimed to be the voice of Jesus. He never saw a reanimated body like Thomas allegedly did.
Number 4, the brother of Jesus and famously skeptical James was suddenly converted after he believed he had seen the risen Jesus. Habermas also noted that somewhere around 75% of scholars also agree that Jesus' tomb was found empty. The best explanation of these minimal facts is that Jesus was, in fact, resurrected from the dead.
No, it isn't. Literally every non-paranormal explanation is more probable. Mass hallucination is very rare, but it's not as rare as resurrection. The idea that all of the disciples conspired to lie about Jesus resurrecting would be unlikely, but conspiracies do happen, and they happen a lot more often than resurrections, therefore that is more probable. The idea that the stories about Jesus were passed around orally for decades and were embellished or misunderstood to be about a resurrection is vastly more probable than an actual resurrection.
If you want to learn more about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I recommend a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas. If you want to go a little deeper, you can pick up N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. This brings us to question number 3. Has science disproved God?
I've never heard an atheist ask this question or claim that science has disproved God. Given the self-contradictory definition of God that I often hear apologists and theologians use, I do think that logic has disproved God, but it's rare that the empirical sciences can disprove the existence of anything. Science hasn't disproved the existence of fairies or leprechauns either.
Scientists study the material world, and by definition, God is not material.
No, science studies the physical world. Energy isn't material either, but science still studies it because it is still physical. But if God is not material or even physical, what is he? What does it mean to say that something exists at all if it doesn't exist physically? I don't know how to understand existence as anything other than a physical phenomenon.
In fact, the statement, God does not exist, is not actually a statement of science. It's a philosophical statement. It can't be proven in a lab.
No, but it can be proven logically, at least with respect to the definitions of God that say he can exist independent of space and time. That's a contradiction that cannot be true.
So in order for scientists to assert that God does not exist, they have to filter their evidence through the philosophical lens of materialism, which excludes the possibility of anything outside the material realm.
I think you mean physicalism, because science does deal with things outside the material realm. It just can't deal with anything outside of the physical realm, but neither can any philosophy that I recognize as coherent.
Frank Turek offers this illustration in his book, Stealing from God. Quote, to say that a scientist can disprove the existence of God is like saying a mechanic can disprove the existence of Henry Ford.
Well, the difference is that Henry Ford's existence can be far more firmly demonstrated than God's. The concept of Henry Ford's existence is recognizably coherent, and there is empirical evidence that he existed. Neither is the case with respect to God.
Question number 4. Does the Bible condone slavery?
It literally says you may buy slaves. If that's not condoning slavery, what would be?
When Americans hear the word slave, we think of the abuse and forced labor of African Americans in the antebellum South. But when we look to the Old Testament system that God instituted, the Hebrew word ebed, which is often translated as slave in English, did not carry the same negative connotation it does in our modern context.
It carries the denotative meaning that a person is forced to work against their will. That in and of itself makes it unconscionable.
So in ancient Israel, this type of servanthood was a system in which a destitute person could voluntarily work to pay off a debt.
If they were a fellow Israelite. If they were purchased from a foreign nation, there was nothing voluntary about their servitude. Even when it came to the indentured servants, there was a rule that said that if the enslaved person got married and had children during their servitude, once the period of servitude expired, the enslaved person could go free, but the wife and kids would remain property of the slave master permanently and against their will.
Although it wasn't a perfect system, they were given food and shelter, legal rights, and protection from physical mistreatment.
Slaves in the South were given food and shelter, so what? Even a horse gets that if someone owns one.
After 7 years, they were released from their debt and servitude and given a generous gift of flocks and wine and grain.
That's not much consolation given that their wives and kids would remain in the slave master's custody.
In some cases, the Israelites kept servants from surrounding nations as a result of war, but they were commanded to treat them humanely, and those servants were also protected from mistreatment under biblical law.
Oh, okay. That makes the forced labor just fine then. If you get a pet today, there are laws against mistreating them. Would that make it okay to keep a person in captivity as a pet?
In fact, human trafficking was punishable by death in the Old Testament.
So taking captives during war, enslaving them, and selling them doesn't count as human trafficking?
Now, the type of slavery that was sanctioned by the Roman Empire in the New Testament context was a bit different than the type of system God instituted for Israel in the Old Testament. But it's interesting to note that nowhere in the New Testament is this type of slavery condoned. In fact, anywhere from 85 to 90% of the Roman population were slaves.
What's your point? Lots of people were doing it, therefore it was okay? How is that a defense of the kinds of slavery the Bible does condone?
And encouraging slaves to rebel against their masters would have meant execution or branding. Instead, the Apostle Paul taught that slaves were on equal terms with free people in the eyes of God.
It would have been nice if he had had the balls to say they should all be freed from slavery.
And encouraged change beginning in hearts. This radically countercultural teaching began to play out in history and would eventually inspire people like John Wesley and William Wilberforce to oppose modern slavery and support abolition.
In what passage did Paul encourage people to change their hearts about slavery? If he did, why didn't he tell people whose hearts changed about slavery to not buy slaves?
If you want to take a deeper look at the more problematic Bible passages regarding slavery, I recommend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? I'm also going to link to a lecture from Dr. Peter Williams entitled, Does the Bible Support Slavery?
Which Peter Williams? Funnily enough, there are actually two apologists, both named Peter Williams.
This brings us to question number 5. Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Jesus actually existed?
No first-hand or archaeological evidence, no. Jesus never wrote anything, there are no contemporaneous statues or paintings of Jesus.
So this claim tends to make the rounds on social media from time to time, but the answer is really quite simple. There are 10 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus as an actual person within 150 years of his life.
And every one of them simply repeated what Christians were saying about Jesus. Not a single one of them is an independent account.
He's mentioned by Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Plegon, Thallus, Suetonius, Lucian, Celsus, Marabar Serapion, and the Jewish Talmud.
And not a single one of them was a witness to Jesus or anything he allegedly did. I suspect that Jesus existed, but these accounts only confirm that Christians existed at the time. They don't confirm that Jesus did. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.